was a very instant hush. Thank you very much. Welcome along, everybody. It's a delight to see so many of you here. It's especially a delight to see so many of the kind of people that want to come inside on a day like this and listen to talks about history. You are our people, and we very much appreciate it. So thank you very much. Just by way of introduction, we are here obviously for the new Rowntree Histories event. One thing I'll just mention at the start is that you may have noticed that we are just two speakers today. I'm very sorry to say that Kat Oakley is unwell and is unable to join us, but I'm sure you'll all send your best wishes to her. But by no means does that diminish the event. We've got two very, very interesting talks and plenty more time for discussion as well, which you will hopefully play a full part in. Just to say the usual housekeeping, for those of you in the room, there is no fire alarm test scheduled, so if it goes off it's a real one, and the exits are all signposted. And a big hello to everybody watching online as well. You'll notice there are quite a few cameras around. We've got lots of people hopefully watching us, not just here in York, but hopefully around the world too, and you're very welcome to the event. To introduce myself, I'm Gary Brennan. I am Keeper of Archives and Special Collections at the Borthwick Institute for Archives at the University of York. And amongst the fantastic collections of archives that we hold at the university include the archives of the Rowntree Company, the Rowntree family, and the Rowntree Trusts. And this fantastic interlinked network of archives is in itself a internationally significant resource, providing so much potential for research of all kinds, from people's personal histories to social policy, the development of social policy, social history, social care, and much, much more besides. And I'm very pleased that the subjects that we have today are all in some way linked through to some of the archives that we hold, and I extend that invite to all of you after this event to come and look at the archive yourself. The event today is from the Rowntree Society. I will briefly inhabit the personage of Kat Oakley on this one. The Rowntree Society facilitates and supports projects and activities for a range of audiences through collaborative working across education, libraries and archives, local government, the voluntary sector and the creative sector. The Society functions as a reliable source of information, promotes and supports new interdisciplinary research, produces heritage-related materials for people of all ages and backgrounds, and acts in an advisory capacity on projects and initiatives connected to Rowntree histories and values. And at this point, I'd just like to give a note of thanks to our funders for the Rowntree Society, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, who enable the work of the Rowntree Society. I mentioned the archives that we hold, and we've noted these were fully listed thanks to a Wellcome Trust-funded project between 2017 and 2019. What that has done in listing the archives of the Rowntree family and trust, as I mentioned, is opened up all sorts of new doors and avenues for research into the Rowntree family, their contribution to the city and the wider world, and the legacy of the family's activities as well. And really what we want to see is the expansion and broadening of those horizons of research to look at topics that have not been investigated fully in the past. And with us tonight, with us this afternoon, are two excellent speakers. We've got Shaun Pitt and Callum Reilly with us. I will invite Shaun up first. We've got a talk each, so it'll be around about 20 minutes in duration. We'll have one talk after the other, and then we'll get into questions and a conversation between our panellists as well. So first of all, I'd like to welcome up Shaun Pitt. Shaun's an independent researcher who's working on his PhD thesis entitled Piotr Kropotkin, Anarcho-Communist Networks and British New Liberalism, 1886 to 1921. His interests include the history of anarchist movements, specifically mainstream connections to anarchism, women in left-wing networks, the history of the social sciences and humanities, and Anglo-Russian connections before the Bolshevik Revolution. Shaun's title today is Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree and Piotr Kropotkin, A Friendship Transcending Politics. Shaun, over to you.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Oh, microphone is coming through. Yes, as you all know from my introduction, I'm writing a thesis on the overlap between New Liberal and anarchist networks at the beginning of the 20th century. Get my first slide up. This paper, however, will specifically be focusing on Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree and Piotr Kropotkin's friendship, a friendship that is actually quite important to my PhD thesis. Seebohm, as he preferred to be called, although I will probably call him Rowntree quite a few times throughout the presentation, was heavily connected to New Liberal political networks, especially in the 1910s because of his close working relationship with David Lloyd George, who many will know was Prime Minister of Britain from 1916 to 1922 and was Chancellor of the Exchequer from 1908 to 1915. Kropotkin, on the other hand, was arguably the most prominent exponent of anarchist communism during this time period. But because of his romantic life story, his aristocratic upbringing, and his eventual refugee status in Britain, he was well acquainted with a variety of British public intellectuals across the political spectrum. Anarchism, as many will be aware, is a political philosophy focused around individual freedom that is normally opposed to capitalist modes of production and tends to attempt to situate the individual into a concept of communal society. It is a political philosophy associated with violence, but the majority of its proponents, including Kropotkin, were largely opposed to violent action. Kropotkin was born into an aristocratic family and was related to the Rurik dynasty, which had ruled over most of Russia for more than 700 years before the rise of the Romanovs. As a result, he was a prince until he renounced his title at the precocious age of 12 and was supported by his family until he decided against a military career in the 1870s when he was in his 30s, a few years after this picture was taken. I think he's in military uniform, in fact. This was when he involved himself in radical politics in Russia, being inspired by the terrible conditions of Russia's illiterate peasant population that he had encountered during his time as a soldier in Siberia. There we are. This activism would lead to his imprisonment, exile, and eventually his settling in Britain in 1886. Seebohm Rowntree, while from nowhere near the aristocratic upbringing of Kropotkin, had a similarly regimented and privileged start to life. He was born in 1871, second of the 4 sons of Joseph Rowntree, and was educated by governesses at home and at the Quaker Bootham School before joining his father's business. Similar to Kropotkin, in his 30s he also became motivated by rising poverty to get involved in political discussions, and he released his famous study, Poverty, A Study of Town Life, in 1901, which I've pictured here. They lived such different adult lives, however. Kropotkin gave up a life of luxury and comfort as a prince and aspiring scientist for one of political oppression, underground politics, imprisonments, and seeking refuge across Europe in many countries over the course of his life. While Seebohm spent his youth developing chemistry for the Rowntrees, he was also analysing the poverty he saw around him, and they were both ultimately allowed a comfortable life, but were too troubled by the injustice of the world around them to do this. But while this led Kropotkin to anarchism, it led Rowntree to a form of liberalism. He tended to avoid specifically delineating. I'm not even sure Rowntree would have described himself as a liberal, but his politics fit not very neatly into that. All right, just a quick personal background to my relationship with Kropotkin and Rowntree's relationship. 6 years ago, I was working in a library in London, and I was contemplating studying a PhD on Kropotkin's personal networks. I had already exhaustively searched most archives in Britain for any mention of Kropotkin, but was given a link to the State Archive of the Russian Federation's catalogue. And that picture on the left is the State Archive of the Russian Federation. And they listed all of the correspondence that Kropotkin had received, but it was often in broken English and was often transliterated to the extent that names were indecipherable. It was incredibly large and contained over 30,000 pages of letters received by Kropotkin. But one name instantly popped out to me. I saw that a Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree, who was unknown to me at the time, had sent 53 sheets of correspondence to Kropotkin throughout the period of 1901 and 1917. In addition to this, there were also 4 sheets of letters from a B.S. row, which shows you how the catalogue was quite messy. And from looking at them, I later confirmed these were also from Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree. And 53 was quite a lot of letters, or 57 in total, quite a lot of letters from a famous British intellectual figure who clearly is not an anarchist. This and more later findings eventually led me to a PhD topic on Kropotkin's relationship with liberal reformers at the beginning of the 20th century. It took me nearly 3 years to see this correspondence because of the pandemic, and I provide an example of this pictured here in the top right, which is the first letter from Rowntree to Kropotkin. I was going to say the first one in the archive, but it is definitely the first letter he received, which I will go in detail about in the next slide, but it's formal and clearly the first letter and includes a letter of introduction at the end. Unfortunately, Rowntree either destroyed the majority of his correspondence from Kropotkin or it was lost somewhere along the way, as only a very small number of letters survive here in the Borthwick archive, which is pictured in the bottom right, which you probably recognise because obviously it's in York. The Borthwick archive does, however, show that Kropotkin and his wife Sophie stayed with Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree for a week at their house here in York in 1908. Additionally, Seebohm and his wife Lydia also hosted Kropotkin's friend, the German anarchist Karl Walter, for 2 days in 1905. The correspondence in Russia also confirms that Kropotkin and Rowntree met in London, where Kropotkin lived for the vast majority of his life in Britain. They met a few times, as well as trying to meet up with each other while both were holidaying in Italy. Unfortunately, I think his wife was very ill and they couldn't meet up in the end. When they first started corresponding in 1901, Kropotkin was 59 and Rowntree was 30. I'm unsure of the date of the picture of Rowntree here, but the picture of Kropotkin is very near to the time in which they started their correspondence. And I include them here to show the age gap between the two men, because I think that Seebohm probably is younger than 30 in that picture. But you get the picture. Seebohm was introduced by their mutual friend John Hobson, who's also a very prominent liberal, and was very enamoured with Kropotkin, and also quite a young man at the time. And when they first started corresponding with each other, Kropotkin was about to enter a period of largely sedentary writing and often sustained illness as he entered his 60s, while Rowntree was about to enter the most productive period of his adult life as a 30-year-old man who'd just written The Poverty, a Study of Town Life. Initially, their conversation centred around... There we go. That was mentioned before. Yes, initially their conversation centred around Rowntree's interest in remedying the poverty that he had observed in his home city of York and written about in his book, Poverty, a Study of Town Life. He saw potential in the reforms, especially those focused around agriculture, that Kropotkin proposed in his Fields, Factories and Workshops. An example of a front cover of that book is pictured here. It's important to note here also that Kropotkin intentionally wrote this book as a moderate practical book focused on the British economy to attract interest from less radical British political reformers. A nice local note that might interest the audience is that the letter, which I showed in the previous slide, you probably have already seen, was addressed from 32 St Mary's here in York, from the Rowntrees to Kropotkin. Their first letter is largely formal and focuses around Rowntree asking the Russian for sources of information and also asking if he might come up to York and provide expertise in agricultural production at the dairy farm the Rowntree family was going to set up. Importantly, Rowntree also said, "I have read your book, Fields, Factories and Workshops, with deep interest and have felt such warm sympathy with the views that you express that I am anxious to do something to make them more widely known. I am therefore proposing to try and get some information about the possibilities of agriculture into a very popular form and spread this information either by lectures or pamphlets." Over the next few years, they corresponded frequently and less formally and collaborated on a variety of projects. Rowntree was keenly aware that Kropotkin as a Russian anarchist refugee, as a Russian anarchist refugee, was not greatly connected to British publishing networks, and endeavoured to distribute Kropotkin's ideas more widely by helping him navigate these networks. This included a republishing of Fields, Factories and Workshops, which the two discussed at great length. Rowntree sent his book on poverty in York to Kropotkin, saying, "The arguments I make in this book appear to me to be a strong argument in favour of some union of town and country life, such as you advocate in your book, Fields, Factories and Workshops." The correspondence shows Rowntree repeatedly celebrating the increased distribution of Kropotkin's ideas, and even taking personal financial risks to improve the distribution of later editions of Kropotkin's book, both here and in Europe and in America. These discussions about the British publishing industry continued as from 1906, Rowntree advised Kropotkin at length about the republishing of his memoirs, which were entitled Memoirs of a Revolutionist, which were first published as a book in 1899. And he also helped Kropotkin correspond with and organise the financial logistics with British literary agents. Rowntree also discussed with Kropotkin the practicalities of education, farming and town planning that he was thinking about introducing at New Earswick. He said in 1901, "Since I last saw you," I want New Earswick. There we go. "As I last saw you, my father bought 123 acres of land a mile from the factory for a village community. I should like to talk this over with you for some time before we begin to lay it out." Unfortunately, as I discussed before, Kropotkin's replies to Rowntree have not survived, except for one letter dated 1912, where Kropotkin expresses his happiness to hear about the schooling at New Earswick. Rowntree himself was also involved in the Campaign for Russian Freedom, a campaign to pressure Russia into reducing its oppression of minorities and introducing more political freedom, and it was especially concerned with the oppression of Jewish people in Russia at the end of the 19th century. This brought he and Kropotkin into collaboration on another topic. Seebohm and his wife, Lydia, joined Kropotkin's wife, Sophie, on the Committee for the Relief of Russian Exiles in northern Russia and Siberia. And Seebohm asked Piotr for advice on how to get Quaker funds to people who needed them in Russia. In a 1906 letter, Seebohm stressed the importance of Kropotkin's presence in Britain as a prominent critic of the Russian government. In the same letter, he also expressed his deep concern that his friend Kropotkin was considering a return to Russia. It was a brief emotional letter and a correspondence dominated by practical concerns that showed the bond the two men had developed in the 5 years since their first correspondence. Throughout this period, Kropotkin lent Seebohm obscure agricultural books, such as the American Yearbook on Agriculture, and also introduced Rowntree to individuals who could instruct him about agricultural policy, something that would prove very useful for the Englishman's later book, Land and Labour, Lessons from Belgium, which I include a picture of here as well, which I think is a picture of different kinds of agriculture in Belgium. In 1910, so probably not that interesting to the audience, but a nice picture at least. This was also a book that Sophie Kropotkin positively reviewed at a later date in a prominent publication, Sophie being Piotr's wife. Upon Seebohm's return from Belgium in February 1906, he asked Piotr for introductions to pertinent individuals in Holland, Denmark, Italy and Switzerland, and said, "I found your introduction so helpful in Belgium." And also in 1907, when the newspaper The Speaker was renamed as The Nation under new ownership by the Rowntree family, Seebohm stressed his desire for Kropotkin to contribute work on scientific and social questions, a request he would repeat in 1909 also. Both times he stressed that these articles would be a great help to his fledgling paper. When the Liberal Party won the 1910 election on a platform of widespread social reform, Seebohm wrote excitedly of the prospect that at last something very real and practical may be done to make social progress in England more possible. And he wrote this letter to Kropotkin and asked the anarchist for his opinion. And again, unfortunately, we don't have the correspondence going the other way. to see what Kropotkin's opinions were about the 1910 election, which obviously might have caused a fracture between the two, one of them being a liberal, one of them being an anarchist. Which leads me neatly on to the next bit. Because by 1912, Seebohm was very close to the Liberal government in Britain through his friend and future Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who was now Chancellor of the Exchequer. Lloyd George is pictured here on the left with Seebohm, and also he's got quite a cute dog as well. And the now Chancellor tasked Seebohm with a well-funded governmental investigation into British agriculture. This brought him more frequently to London, where he would meet the Russian, Kropotkin obviously, a few times during this period, despite the fact that Kropotkin had moved to Brighton in 1911 for his health. He asked Kropotkin for advice and any additional work that wasn't already included in fields, factories and workshops. He also recommended his book on Belgian agriculture and Kropotkin's work to other governmental ministers and investigators involved in the investigation. And he asked the Russian about the new edition. There we go. He asked the Russian about the new edition of Fields, Factories and Workshops, which was later published in 1913, and if it included any more information about English agriculture that hadn't yet been released. After 1912, they corresponded less often, owing in part to Rowntree's heavy involvement in liberal social policy before and during World War I, as during World War I he would work in the Ministry of Munitions, obviously an important department during the First World War. He was so busy during this period, Seebohm Rowntree, that he joked that his wife might divorce him on grounds of desertion and asked David Lloyd George if the Treasury could pay for his defence if it happened. And another contributor, unfortunately, to this declining friendship was that Kropotkin's health was worsening as he entered his 70s and moved out of London to get away from the smog. And again, as Rowntree was entering his 40s and was now in the peak of his life in terms of his prominence in British society. But during this period, they continued to discuss Kropotkin's work, and unlike many of the Russians' liberal friends, Seebohm also read his work on anarchism and read his article, Modern Science and Anarchism and Direct Action of Environment and Evolution, and again, his eventually posthumously published book on ethics. And in the last letter from Seebohm Rowntree to Kropotkin, dated 11th April 1917, Rowntree is joyous at the news of the first 1917 revolution in Russia and Kropotkin's plans to return to his homeland. He apologises for rarely visiting Kropotkin in Brighton, but claims, "My thoughts have often been with you," and hopes that the ageing anarchist has enough years left to help guide the progressive movement in Russia. The letter ends, "Your many friends will miss you. Nevertheless, they know that you go home to the work you have wanted to do your whole life." And you can see here a picture of Kropotkin just after his return to Russia in 1917, a few years before his death in 1921. Okay, let's move to my last slide. My presentation is entitled Benjamin Seebohm Rowntree and Piotr Kropotkin, A Friendship Transcending Politics. Rowntree and Kropotkin's friendship certainly transcended their political differences, with Rowntree raised as a quasi-liberal pacifist and Kropotkin becoming an anarchist communist over the course of his life, and having friends who were violent terrorists and also being surrounded by communists, both anarchists or otherwise, including Vladimir Lenin, who he was friends with up until and even shortly after the revolution. But I think it also speaks to the ability for single issues to unite individuals across the political spectrum, and also potentially of a bygone time where friendships across the political aisle were perhaps more common. In the correspondence that we have available, they almost never discuss their broader ideological positions and focus entirely on the immediate progress they could make. Even when Kropotkin sends Rowntree his work on anarchism, this isn't discussed. They focus entirely on the practical task at hand, while also slowly bonding over many years of correspondence. Therefore, at the centre of this were two men disunited by so many opinions and the methods by which to ultimately solve society's problems, but they were united by a belief that they could improve the lot of the poor by collaborating in the short term. And that's me done.
Well, thank you very much, Shaun. And you may well be brewing up questions already. I would just ask you just to jot them down or put them in your little on your mental memory cards, because we'll come to those later on. Because before we get to the Q&A, we'd like to listen to Callum Reilly, who is with us here today as well. Callum is an archaeologist and White Rose College of Arts and Humanities doctoral researcher here at the University of York, specialising in the modern world. His research project, Landscapes of Reform, investigates the relationship between social improvement, housing and the landscape in two planned working class settlements in Yorkshire. The garden village of New Earswick, founded by Joseph Rowntree here in York, and Woodlands Model Mining Village near Doncaster. And Callum's going to talk to us today about reform in the garden village of New Earswick. Callum.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the introduction, Gary, and thank you to Shaun for the interesting opening talk. So, hello everyone, I'm Callum, and today I'm going to be talking about one of Joseph Rowntree's projects close to home, which is his role in founding the garden village of New Earswick, which, as many of you may know, is just a couple of miles north of here. As Gary said, this is based on my PhD research at the University of York, which is now completed. And as part of that project, I investigated the landscape development, design and planning of two settlements built by reformers during the early 20th century, and one of those was New Earswick. I'm an archaeologist, but specifically I'm a historical archaeologist, which means as well as using physical evidence to understand the past, as many archaeologists do, so that, for example, that includes the surviving landscape and its buildings, I also combine that with historical documents, writing, photographs and maps and other sources to understand the modern world. And so by exploring Rowntree's work with this new perspective, I'm hoping to unpick some of what we might take for granted, especially about the relation between the wider social reform work of the Rowntrees and their specific work at New Earswick. So for those who aren't perhaps familiar, the village of New Earswick was founded in 1902 by Joseph Rowntree, 2 miles north of the centre of York and a mile north of the Rowntree Cocoa Works on Haxby Road. Construction began in the same year in 1902, and 2 years later in 1904, Rowntree established a charitable village trust to manage the village, and that trust continues to this day as the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust. But its original intention was to use the village to improve living conditions for industrial workers. The village itself is recognisable today for its well-designed arts and crafts style housing and its extensive greenery, which you can see in the image on the left there. And you can also kind of get a sense of that from the plan over on the right. But even at the time of its creation, it earned an international reputation as a pioneering example of better housing and better planning. And it became known as one of the first garden villages, following the spirit of the Garden City movement. This was the movement founded by Ebenezer Howard, who himself actually had a few anarchist influences. But it's based on kind of low-density settlements with plenty of open spaces and, crucially, houses at affordable rents. Now, there were villages besides New Earswick that fit this description that already existed at this time. So the Laver Brothers Port Sunlight, their model village near Liverpool, and Bourneville, the model village founded by Rowntree's fellow Quaker and, in some ways, business rival, George Cadbury, on the outskirts of Birmingham. Both of those were founded a few years earlier, and each of those has subtly different motivations, but it was Rowntree's input at New Earswick that defined it and singled the garden village form as a radically new type of settlement. So with that in mind, I wanted to start by exploring the Rowntree's possible motivation for building such a village, because it wasn't purely social. It was closely related to ideas of the landscape, of the landscape, which I, as an archaeologist, I'm especially interested in. So the story often goes that it was a direct response to to the revelations of Seebohm Rowntree, Joseph's son, in his landmark survey of poverty in York, which Shaun has kind of introduced for us. Now, there is some logic to this. That research was only published the year before New Earswick was founded. So if poverty in York was the problem, then communities like New Earswick were the solution, or so the story goes. It's also sometimes implied that New Earswick was specifically intended to accommodate York's working class poor, especially those living in Hungate, which was described as the slum district of York, which is pictured here. But apart from anything else, the poorest living in places like Hungate would not have been able to afford even the modest rents of New Earswick's housing. So instead, I want to argue that the Rowntree's understanding of working class districts and of poverty came to bear in New Earswick in a completely different way. In general, Seebohm Rowntree was quite scathing of Hungate's conditions. So this is a quote from his poverty publication. The barren gardens, he describes here, are taken as a sign of the area's poverty, hence kind of alluding to the idea of the landscape. He also spoke of the reckless expenditure of the working class poor on what he deemed to be irresponsible behaviours, drinking, gambling and so on. So while I think it's true to say that his work portrayed poverty as an environmental condition, individuals were still sometimes implicated. But here I wanted to draw attention to this phrase, the disinclination to move to better surroundings. Although it is sort of critical of residents of Hungate, it implies that Seebohm Rowntree at least recognised that there was some reason for residents to stay. And partly that may have to do with lacking the money to move elsewhere, but it also related to the community that formed in Hungate streets and courtyards like those depicted in this photograph. And here he alludes to one of the strengths of those communities, the idea of a shared space that allows a community to form, as well as a cooperative approach to living. In this quote, he was specifically talking about the domestic labour of women, the idea that women from multiple households could pool resources and save labour in monotonous work such as washing, and do that on a cooperative basis. But the broader point is how these kinds of communal spaces made this possible. So I'm going to return to this a little bit later, but for now I want to skip forward to the social aims behind New Earswick and specifically its founder, Joseph Rowntree. So I've explained that New Earswick was not necessarily intended to accommodate the very poorest. Partly it's a question of the kinds of people that Joseph Rowntree did expect to live there. Rowntree believed that it should benefit working class people, but by his own admission, he defined the working classes very broadly. He defined them as people who make a living through the work of their hands or their minds, and interestingly, all those who earn a small income from invested capital. So that includes the kind of traditionally, people who are traditionally seen as members of the working class, for example, craftspeople, mechanics and factory workers. But it also includes what others, even at the time, would have described as middle or at least intermediate class workers, for example, shopkeepers, professions such as teachers and especially clerks. So much so that as little as 50% of early New Earswick's residents fell into the working class category as it was defined at the time of the 1911 census. So this chart here shows the number of households in New Earswick in 1911 according to their classification. And even then, most of the village's working class residents were skilled craftspeople and makers, this class 3 category in grey, rather than lower paid heavy labourers. What that meant for New Earswick was that it was intended to be a socially mixed experimental community, and it was actively portrayed this way, with working and middle class people living side by side. And this was I suppose what was believed would prevent slum conditions from taking root. And just to talk about this image specifically, this was taken in around 1920, and it captures a lot of the ideals that the trustees sought. We can see children playing in the streets, the use of public spaces for informal social purposes like this is a trait that Seebohm Rowntree associated with working class communities, for example, when he talks about people of districts like Hungate congregating in the streets and courtyards. In the same frame, there's a respectable looking figure in a suit and a bowler hat who, to me, I think he looks a little bit like Seebohm Rowntree. I think he was actually the village doctor, but regardless, it suggests someone of perhaps middle class status. So what this image shows then, rather than being an assemblage of houses to accommodate industrial workers, a kind of dormitory settlement, it's a new kind of community that's brought together by the shared landscape and a common architecture. Which brings me on to the role of the architects Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin, who Rowntree appointed to design the village. They brought their own agenda. Now, the architects shared with the Rowntrees a general understanding of working class culture and a belief in their self-improvement. They didn't necessarily believe that the best way for society to improve was to imitate the middle classes. And as one example, that was often symbolised by the parlour or the sitting room inside the home. The architects actively disliked parlours because they saw them as an unnecessary extravagance in working class homes. This is a room that is used mainly for, at least in a middle class context, it's used for formal social gatherings. So here, their suggestion of designing homes with alternative areas for conducting quiet indoor pursuits, such as reading. That also, those kind of indoor pursuits also required light, which is why so many of their homes were designed to let in daylight from multiple aspects. Still, they didn't always get their design approach right. They initially avoided building homes with parlours at New Earswick, but this was not a popular decision and was met with some criticism of the early residents. So after some mild protests from the residents, they later reintroduced them into their homes at New Earswick, showing at least that they were able to respond to the needs of the village's early residents. It was also about having a respectable aesthetic environment outside as well, and that meant well-kept front gardens for each of the houses. Unlike other model villages, such as Port Sunlight, these were the responsibility of residents. So residents themselves contributed to the pleasant village scene like the one depicted here. The village trustees, the Rowntree family, and their architects shared a belief in the role of gardens and gardening in improving welfare. And that relates to the idea of the so-called rational recreation movement. This was a movement established in the 19th century to encourage respectable alternatives to what reformers saw as questionable leisure and spending habits. So again, instead of drinking and gambling, working class people were encouraged to take part in leisure clubs and sports, and especially gardening. Reformers like Rowntree believed that this would protect communities from being trapped in secondary poverty by what they saw as wasting their income. Now, if that all sounds a little bit like social control, I suppose it's worth remembering that health was another important component. This was a time, the early 20th century, when new ideas of health and well-being began to emerge. So the idea of providing gardens for all of New Earswick's residents, regardless of their status, was actually a radical step, giving all the chance to benefit from them. I want to turn now to the wider landscape of the village as it actually appeared. This aerial photograph was also taken in around 1920. It shows the village at about half to maybe a third of the size it is now. Even at this scale, we can see some of the ways that the architects planned it to encourage informal interactions. So for example, in the curving streets that follow the River Foss, rather than being laid out in a strict grid system, which kind of implies a less hierarchical approach. The housing was mostly grouped in blocks of 4 or more rather than detached or semi-detached housing, and that meant more chances for interactions between neighbours. You can also see in this photograph how big some of the gardens were, and as well as the extent of the recreational spaces that were provided, which I've highlighted, like the village green, the tennis courts and the bowling greens, not to mention the rural surroundings, which you can see at the edges of the photograph. All of this is evidence of a community that was designed with rational recreation and the enjoyment of outdoor spaces at its core. But there's one part of the landscape that I wanted to focus on, because this represents where the early observations of Seebohm Rowntree and the architect's radical ideas met. So this is Ivy Place, which is a set of 20 houses arranged in 3 blocks surrounding an open rectangular space, and that was completed before 1910. The architects described this arrangement as a quadrangle, and this was an idea that they had already experimented with elsewhere, like in this design drawing here. Arranging houses like this was directly related to the architect's ideas of cooperative living and the shared use of space. For example, shared cooking and cleaning facilities, as well as collective childcare. And all of those drew from anarchist and socialist thinking. So compare that drawing with Ivy Place at New Earswick as it appears today on the left. Now, in reality, there were no formal communal facilities at Ivy Place, but I think the similarity in the design suggests that they may have been part of their broader intention. And the broader point still stands, that these small, almost semi-enclosed spaces between the houses encourage neighbourly interactions, as well as, and this idea was also applied to the cul-de-sacs that defined the interwar village. It was also an advantage for parents, as having semi-enclosed spaces like this meant that a parent could keep watch over their children outside. So these were in some ways a part of the village's social infrastructure. And if we look at the older half of the image on the right, we can get a sense of how the landscape has changed since it was first designed. So instead of the open lawn that we see today, there were detached, almost allotment-style gardens. And that goes back to the reason why outdoor spaces were so important for villages like New Earswick. They weren't just ornamental, they were workable spaces, and by actively maintaining them, residents could become more respectable, but more importantly, happier and healthier. And the fact that residents were responsible for maintaining their gardens is one way that New Earswick went beyond the more usual approach of reformers to maintain strict control of their model villages. And the use of gardens at New Earswick enabled residents to shape their surroundings. Sometimes they did so in ways that reflected the trustees and Joseph Rowntree's ideas about what a pleasant, respectable environment should look like. And this photograph is focused on one garden in particular. This was the prize-winning garden of a resident in the earliest part of the village. You can perhaps just make out it's a productive cottage-style garden with fruit trees and shrubs. Next door, over on the right, there are also some cold frames for growing produce. Gardens like these reflected the value of the labour that their tenants put into them, and that itself was essential for reform. It wasn't something imposed on residents so much as something that they actually willingly participated in. Occasionally, though, residents shaped their environment in ways that didn't necessarily align with the views of New Earswick's trustees. So this ornamental rockery is a good example. The trustees saw the act of gardening, the physical work put into it, as a moral and healthy activity. So in creating a non-productive, lower maintenance garden like this rockery, the tenant of this house was perhaps deviating from what the trustees expected of them. that points to some of the ways in which New Earswick evolved beyond Rowntree's original vision. But it also shows the relative freedom that residents had over their outdoor spaces, again, in contrast to earlier villages that had gone before. And I think that's why New Earswick was continuously framed as a successful example of an independent garden village, including up until today. So why are these issues still relevant today? What is the legacy of garden villages like New Earswick in the 21st century? I think the obvious connection is the current housing crisis and proposed solutions to it. Interestingly, potential solutions have used the language of the garden city movement and specifically garden villages. There are, I think, nearly 50 government-backed garden village and garden town schemes being built across this country. But there are signs that some of the original principles of the movement are being sidelined. And as the pandemic has showed all too clearly, gardens and green open spaces are both important for psychological and physical well-being, as well as community interactions. So there's a very real risk that we're losing sight of what made communities like New Earswick unique and different from what had gone before. Simply building new, even well-designed homes without the kind of social infrastructure that New Earswick's landscape enabled just isn't enough. And that's why it's positive that campaigning organisations like the Town and Country Planning Association still use early examples like New Earswick as kind of examples of best practice in well-planned communities. It's why it's positive that Rowntree's work is being continued in building new communities like Derwentthorpe here, which is also built by the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust. But it's not clear to me that most of the current crop of new garden villages are ambitious enough to tackle the scale of current problems, rising inequalities, lack of affordability, and environmental issues like climate change. I think where New Earswick has been especially successful is because of its small scale. Only a handful of houses were built each year of its early existence, which meant that there was time to adapt its design as society changes. And crucially, the trustees and their architects seem to have been actively listening to those changing needs. The legacy of New Earswick, then, was not just about providing housing to relieve an immediate practical problem, but using house building and community building as a way of transforming and reforming society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Callum and Shaun, the two excellent and very interesting presentations now there. We're about to go into the question and answer and discussion section. I'll just say before we get going how we're going to operate this. We have our roving microphones in the room, so please do make sure you do speak into the microphone. That's partly for the benefit of ourselves in the hall, but mostly for the benefit for everyone who's viewing somewhere else in the world right now. I will say though that we will just be taking questions from those of you here in the hall with us this afternoon. Those of you who are watching live on the live stream, you can submit any burning questions that you have via our email address after the event via info@rowntreesociety.org.uk, and our speakers will get back to you on those as soon as we can. Right, okay, I'm going to do the cheeky thing. I know we've got Stephen and I think Stan who have got our microphones. I'm going to take chair's privilege first and pitch in, just let these questions brew. One thing that struck me throughout these that's an undercurrent that I just be interested if you addressed together or discussed between you there, is the influence of Quakerism in all of these things, the influence of Quaker values
in this kind of liberal approach and anarchism, which may have felt like a surprise to many of us listening to that talk. Rowntrees and anarchism are not words that often seem to lie together, and similarly the influence of Quaker values on the development of of New Earswick and the facilities there. So why don't you take it first, Shaun?
Yeah. So I'll go first. It definitely informs. I know it's a surprise, and I don't think the Rowntrees are particularly anarchistically connected, but there are a few different connections. But I do think that some of the essences of the Quaker religion historically have kind of led people towards anarchism as a political philosophy, but also liberalism more broadly, because and I'm not an expert on Quakerism, but more the kind of Quaker networks throughout history is more my expertise. But from my understanding, there are parts of Quakerism that are quite anti-hierarchical. It's kind of there's less of an organised religion element, more of a kind of community-based anti-hierarchical religion. And throughout the 20th and in the 19th, where I specialise more, there are many Quaker anarchists. Not so much in the Rowntree family. In fact, none in the Rowntree family. And I wouldn't say that Seebohm was an anarchist. But some of those ideas about radical change and concern about state control, but also not in being in love with capitalism as an essence, are things that often kind of overlap. And I think that is probably what kind of led people like Seebohm Rowntree to not dislike everything they heard from Kropotkin and the other anarchists that they met through him.
And when we were discussing before the show today, you outlined to me what anarchism actually is. Because I think we were talking about how it's a very loaded term now, and I often describe my daughter's bedroom as anarchy. That's probably not a fair reflection of what anarchy actually is in the context of which you're working.
Well, I think as the term is, as we discussed before, the term has kind of changed, that it is basically synonymous with chaos. But the anarchist political philosophy, which is in some ways kind of unfortunately named because of the way the word anarchy has changed over time, it is basically a political philosophy centred around the idea that there shouldn't be a formalised, centralised, hierarchical structure, that generally our lives are kind of non-hierarchical, and they might become hierarchical for a little bit, where someone's an expert and then someone isn't, and then they kind of transition over time. Friendships are non-hierarchical, for example. Now, and there might be moments where you know more than a friend, and you kind of take over the conversation, etc. But as a political philosophy, it also, at first it wasn't so much, but it became kind of an anti-capitalist philosophy. Partly Kropotkin was kind of a leader of that, of changing it from being kind of what has now become like the kind of American libertarian model of, I want to do my business without anyone taxing me. That kind of transitioned into people like Kropotkin arguing that we could never really have freedom under capitalism, and that basically it's kind of the extension of liberalism kind of being a philosophy of freedom. It's like its origin, but how far that freedom goes. Anarchism in some ways is kind of a more extreme version of that, as in we want even more freedom than that, and also a kind of liberal socialism. So a good way to describe it, as I'll summarise now, is that somebody once said it's like socialism and it's anti-capitalism, but liberalism and its concern for freedom. So it's kind of a synthesis of the two in some ways. And all three of them have a similar origin in the early 19th century to similar philosophers.
Really interesting. Callum, how does Quakerism come into the design of these places like New Earswick, and I assume places like Bourneville as well?
Yeah, so I think certainly one of the biggest influences that I think, Shaun, you kind of alluded to there is just the connections and the kind of networks of fellow Quakers. I think I didn't mention this in my talk, but Rowntree, in some ways, New Earswick was not so original, because at least for the social ambition behind it, the deed of foundation that established what the trust was going to do with the village was copied almost verbatim from George Cadbury's equivalent trust at Bourneville. But I think one of the things that maybe there's also, I suppose, the obvious association that people immediately think of when they think of Quaker villages is this is a dry village, it's a temperance, and Rowntree, like most fellow Quakers, was an advocate of temperance, and New Earswick was maintained as a dry village, much like Bourneville was as well. I suppose the broader thing, he doesn't necessarily seem to have used his Quakerism to advance any kind of Quaker belief in the village itself. He doesn't seem to have gone to the trouble of making sure that there is a dedicated meeting place. But I think one of the interesting things about, and I'm also not an expert on the Society of Friends, but I do think there's also something in the Rowntree's ability to compartmentalise their different ideas. So I think, because one of the things about particular the Quaker industrialists is that they're fully able to separate their business dealings from their kind of social reform work, and I think that's enabled Rowntree to, go off and have these friendships with people of really quite different political beliefs, and I think that is probably one of the maybe less tangible legacies of Quakerism in New Earswick.
Really interesting. Shall we pop and see if we've got any questions from the audience at this point? If you have got a question, just pop your hand up and we'll get the microphone to you. We've got a question. Oh, sorry, I'm going to become David Dimbleby now. Lady on the front row.
Speaking of kind of, I'm not out on a limb, but the business element, did Rowntree ever, did Joseph Rowntree ever sort of, consider the life and the social, global impact of his business within the cocoa industry, where they gather the cocoa beans and probably aren't very kind of, they don't think of the lives and social elements and the fairness of life in a cocoa producing plantation. Have I gone off on a limb?
No, it's okay. I think it's a real shame that Kat can't be with us today, because I think that was very much going to be the subject of her talk. So hopefully that'll reach the light of day in due course. It is something that is now, I can say, as from my position as Keeper of Archives, so obviously I do get a handle on what kinds of research we've been doing. Those are the questions that are being asked now about the Rowntree's attitude to their estates abroad. In terms of, these are products where they have to be grown abroad, they have to be imported, but they're also sold for relatively low cost. And so I think looking at the ability, I think use that phrase compartmentalisation, which is very interesting. How they compartmentalised parts of the business is one of those interesting things. So hopefully, in due course, when Kat's back on her feet, we'll be able to hear what her talk would have been. But it's such a shame, because that's exactly where we were going with that one. So that's all right. You see, we were on the right track, weren't we, with this? Were it not for COVID. Has anyone got another question? Yes, Stephen, gentleman in the blue shirt.
Well, thank you to both of you for really interesting talks. And, I'm glad we've had that discussion about anarchism in a way, because I think, we think of Kropotkin in a way. I mean, he was someone who was key to my early thinking, actually, in terms of thinking about mutual aid and self-organizing, the idea of non-hierarchical communities. So I can see the link, and I think it's very interesting, because if you look at the memorandum that Rowntree produced, which led to the creation of all the trusts, but particularly thinking of New Earswick, he was very keen on self-governing bodies. I mean, he was sort of saying for the village trust, I don't want anything to happen which would stop in some ways the self-governance of the community. So I can really see those links, but I'm fascinated by where it does lead in terms of the political philosophy, you know, between liberalism and that kind of anarchism, which is not the anarchism which is, because I think Kropotkin himself was very much a non-violent person. I'm not sure about that completely, but there was a kind of non-violence involved in both of those, the characters, I think. So I'm really interested in that, and of course I imagine that Kropotkin had a hard time when he went back to Russia, because of course, the Bolsheviks more or less destroyed the anarchist movement there. I don't know if I mean that's just a comment in a way rather than a question, but I think it just brings a link between the two of you.
I think separate because there's I'm trying to remember the first question. Sorry, the second question is a good one about anarchism after, but and also the Rowntree. I wanted to add actually that in one of the early memos from Joseph Rowntree, I can't remember what it was about. I wish I had like a laptop in front of me, but in some of the early memos, Rowntree actually mentions Kropotkin. He mentions fields, factories, and workshops specifically. I don't think he mentions any detail, but he recommends other people on the boards, read this book. He might even distribute some copies of the book. But that's more about kind of how to constitute, I think, some of the kind of vague town planning stuff. Actually, it's kind of reminded me of your question now. The bit about anarchism and liberalism and self-organisation and things like that. I think Callum mentioned Ebenezer Howard earlier on. I think Ebenezer Howard had a similar problem to some of the Rowntrees, where they were kind of, Ebenezer Howard I think was more radical, but they kind of were interested in bits of anarchism, but obviously didn't want to they weren't going to ferment a revolution in this country, and so they were kind of trying these experiments with the land to try and live a kind of more decentralized, not quite anarchist, but more anarchistic, vaguely liberal kind of community, and they were trying to synthesize these two things. And what they found, I think, in both, well, not so much know about the Earswick and some of the more Rowntree experiments, was that they just kind of, these experiments, especially the garden cities were all Ebenezer Howard, Welwyn Garden City and Letchworth, places like that, they all slowly became kind of nicer businesses rather than kind of radical experiments. And I think that's often what happened. My politics are being revealed here, but capitalism tends to consume things that are living within it and make them as less radical as possible, as most amenable to its own needs. And Kropotkin didn't have a good time in Russia for those 4 years. He was offered Minister for Education, in the Soviet government, and he turned it down because he doesn't believe in, obviously, the government. And then he and Lenin correspond a lot in that time period, but it's obviously a conversation of growing disillusionment between the two of them. Both Lenin and Kropotkin become frustrated with the other one. Lenin thinks Kropotkin is too consumed by nitty-gritty cooperative organisations and stuff while he's trying to fight a civil war. And Kropotkin feels that Lenin is losing the bit of the revolution that he cared about. And then 4 years later, he dies in quite intense poverty as well, and has a state funeral in the Soviet Union as well.
Thank you. Any questions?
I'll go to you over here first, then we'll come to yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. It's just a couple of observations, really. Seebohm Rowntree obviously became fairly closely allied with the Liberal government, certainly during the 1920s through his research and was feeding into the Liberal Party. His cousin Arnold was of similar bent, but he moved into the newspaper side of, I suppose what you might call the same mission in a sense, in that Joseph Rowntree bought some of the newspapers, and The Nation particularly, which was the forerunner of the New Statesman, in order to put forward again a different view of society from the Daily Mail, which was their bête noire, and some of the other sort of Tory press. I wonder if you've come across any examples of how successful you think that might have been.
I would like to jump in on this one because actually a lot of my research was around because the Nation have very extensive records in the Borthwick archives, and you do see quite lengthy conversations about, and obviously it's a very ideologically driven newspaper. It's not like we want to make money. There's a lot of very heated discussions between all those different Rowntrees and I can't remember his first name, but H.W. Massingham is the editor for most of this time period. And there's a lot of arguing about that, and it becomes even more intense when Seebohm is in the government and they want to criticise the government, obviously sometimes from a kind of pacifist perspective as well. I think unfortunately what happens is the Nation gets crippled by market forces. It doesn't make enough money and it becomes kind of a loss. And for many years the Rowntrees are keeping it alive to keep their ideas alive. But it becomes destroyed by the fact that they don't have enough readers, they're not making enough money. Maybe they're I don't think they weren't paying that much better than other journalists either. I think it was mostly lack of readership, and also what it slowly became, from my research, was an incredibly important liberal network, but also as a result not a very well read paper outside of liberal networks, unfortunately. It certainly would have been much nicer if it was like one of the biggest selling papers now rather than the Mail.
Okay, we had a question over here. Oop, further on. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is kind of more, I don't know, in terms of... Okay, sorry. Kind of urban planning and community building. Specifically in terms of, I think you were talking about the quadrangles and how they created an opportunity for community and cooperation. And I wondered how you felt, how successful they were, and kind of all of these elements of architecture and land planning that they did, how successful that was. And then also, you spoke about donor thought, but I wondered if there are any other examples of that spreading out across your city and creating more community pockets of people repeating that kind of thing.
Okay. So I suppose in terms of where those, pockets of almost a landscape designed for those micro communities, I suppose they were successful in the sense that, well, they were adopted elsewhere. I mean, one of the things is that you notice about places like parts of New Earswick, like Ivy Place, where you have that kind of arrangement. It's very similar to what you later get in the US in the Radburn model, which then, so that's the idea of having houses that face each other rather than facing the road, with the idea that this would create a kind of community space. And there's certainly, like with cul-de-sacs, there's kind of evidence from kind of contemporary studies on communities that live in cul-de-sac neighbourhoods, that residents of those cul-de-sac streets have closer attachment to their street and to their neighbours. I think it's hard to, I suppose it's hard to identify if they actually recognised that that's what they were doing at the time. Certainly that was the broader intention behind Raymond Unwin and Barry Parker's ideas. I think for the second half of your question, in terms of where those community spaces are still planned in York, I'm not really up to date on kind of modern planning as it exists in the 21st century. I know there are attempts like with the Yoko community planning project, and I think one of the things that's interesting about planning of community spaces nowadays is that there is, at least in principle, a lot more emphasis on involving the community in their creation through co-design, and that's not something that Rowntree seems to have been able to practice at the time these were originally created. But I suppose that's where I see that he has kind of learnt something from the kind of smaller communities that built up around the slum districts. And I should say, when I use the word slums, imagine me using inverted commas, because I don't necessarily agree with that description. That's slightly beside the point.
Coming in on after that, we're talking about the influence on design of places, and we're thinking very modern with Derwentthorpe. Does that new Earswick approach spill out? I'm just thinking of later efforts at social housing, for instance, the big council housing drives of the 30s and into the 50s and 60s. Do those principles of places like New Earswick spill out that wide, or is it a little bit of a bubble of its own?
I think in some ways it's kind of hard to assess, and like people like Alison Sinclair have done a lot of work on kind of the housing legacy of particularly Raymond Unwin's plans for New Earswick. Crucially, a bit like Seebohm Rowntree, Raymond Unwin later found himself having a role in government, being an advisor on housing matters for the kind of post First World War government. And that meant that the kinds of housing that he developed at New Earswick were almost directly kind of enshrined in the government housing manual, the local government board's manual for council housing. And that's why I didn't actually put a slide of this in. I was going to. If anyone has walked up around the Town Hall estate, you'll notice there are some very definite similarities between the housing there and some of the houses at New Earswick. Later on, houses at New Earswick definitely took on a more standardised approach, and they kind of, I think, looked less villagey and more suburban. So this is when you'd start losing the kind of nice arts and crafts gables and get towards something that's a bit more neo-Georgian, I suppose, a little bit more symmetrical, a little bit more standard. And it's those that seem to form the bedrock, at least of the interwar period of council housing. As for the actual design, like the wider approach to planning housing, I think that is something that probably was even at the time a little bit forgotten, because Barry Parker himself later kind of regrets, I think he seems to regret what he may have possibly contributed to in designing some of those houses, which is the growth of kind of ribbon settlements where you just have an endless street sprawling away from kind of urban centres. But I think I think that the legacy, at least for council housing, was more in the more with the actual design of the housing. Although there are still elements of, I suppose, recreational grounds and those kind of spaces.
We've got a question back there. Just in the back. Thank you.
Thank you. It's more an observation than a question, really. In response to the lady who just mentioned Derwentthorpe, I live in Derwentthorpe, and it's certainly true that there are all sorts of echoes of New Earswick in Derwentthorpe. I mean, echoes makes it sound random, obviously they're planned. We have these things called laps, which are really for local areas of play, little squares that in each of the quarters of Derwentthorpe, which are green, have a bench in them. They have something called a stroking stone, which is a bit of rather poor sculpture, a dog or some other kind of animal. The idea is, I think, that you stroke them when you're feeling a bit cross and you might calm down. The challenge of building a mixed community is very much there at Derwentthorpe. The social housing is pepper potted around the place, so you can't really walk around and say, well, that's where the poor people live. My wife and I own our house, but our immediate neighbours on one side are tenants of the housing trust, which means they got their house off the council's housing list, and on the other side they're shared owners, so that they partly pay rent and they're partly buying their house. community activity at Derwentthorpe now. And it's proved to be a very caring community in the context of COVID. But inevitably, perhaps, a lot of this activity is led by, first of all, older people who are time-rich, and people who are homeowners, who are, in other words, more affluent, who sort of struggle to make a living to the same degree that others have. And the challenge is to involve everybody across the boundaries of class, tenure, family size, age, and a number of us who are very active in all that, we're very committed to trying to make that happen. In the context of that, the need for neutral space is very important. Places where people can sit down for a cup of coffee without having to go into each other's houses, because that in itself can be a barrier. And there's great commitment to self-governance too. We now have a governance group which is 50% JRHT and 50% residents, taking on increasing responsibilities. I could bang on about Derwentthorpe for a very long time, but that will do for the moment.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, some interesting echoes in it.
That's a quick question, because it kind of closely relates to what the gentleman was just talking about. You had the quick pie chart of like class composition and New Earswick. And I wondered when the pie chart was from, and if it kind of got, if it changed over time and became less working class or more, or.
That's actually an interesting question. It's one of the things that I have been looking at is the kind of distribution of people from different backgrounds in the early village. That's based on census research that I did, and unfortunately it's one of those things where it's quite difficult to track over time, because particularly in the first half of the 20th century, there's such a rapid change of what is defined as working from middle class, and even like those terms are problematic in themselves. But there's strangely, if there is any change over time, strangely in the interwar period, where the village was more reliant on government subsidies through the 1919 Housing Act, which you might expect would lead to an increase of perhaps less well-off tenants in the village. In fact, it seems as though the opposite is true, and I've been trying to do some digging into why, because at the moment they've just released the 1921 census data, which I've not had a chance to look at yet, so I'm going by the 1911 data and data from the 1939 register. But what I think is possibly happening is residents of the earliest part of the village, as they've grown older, they've become kind of more established workers, because I think initially there were relatively young families that moved there. I think they seem to have moved to the newer housing in the newer half of the village, and that might explain why that the community evolved that way. Interestingly, it's one of the things that's a lot more prominent in my other case study, which I think Gary mentioned very briefly at the start, which is Woodlands mining village on the outskirts of Doncaster, where the village was sort of planned in two halves, but there's very definite distinction that actually persists even to this day between kind of levels of income and poverty in one section from the other. But it's very interesting what you said at the back about the use of pepper potting at Derwentthorpe, and that is definitely something that, okay, they didn't, I don't think, had a term for it at the time, but there's definite sense of, we'll try and mix our kind of, I think there was a distinction between the homes that had parlours in early New Earswick and those without, and the expectation was that the better off members of the community would live in the ones that had parlours. But there's not such a sense of trying to keep them separate. There's a kind of, they weren't necessarily tenure blind, but I think there's a sense of trying to keep them interspersed.
we're coming to the end of our time slot now, so I'm just going to pitch you one last question, which I just very briefly come to. The name of this event has been New Rowntree Histories. And just a very quick observation from you about why you think this hasn't been looked at before, why this is new. So, Shaun, if you take that one first.
Yeah, I guess. So one thing I found throughout my research, but obviously the Rowntrees is kind of included, is that people don't even notice because they see the name Kropotkin or they see they don't see the word anarchism. No one is saying, I want more anarchism in this foundation trust or newspaper or whatever, but they might mention individuals that I know of who are anarchists or have strong connections to them. So number one, there's kind of the practicality of that people kind of avoid the word. And number two, because it is obviously kind of a contentious thing to be connected to. I think those would be the two things for me.
I think for me, I would say I've tried to bring a new approach. Obviously, I'm an archaeologist. I'm not an archaeologist who digs, so I make use of material culture and stuff, basically, that is already surrounding us, which is helpful in the case of New Earswick because so much of it is still, it's more or less intact. I suppose what I've been able to do there is to use some of those methods, the ways that archaeologists look at buildings and look at landscapes, which might be a little bit different from how architectural historians and historians of planning have done, and to kind of, I suppose, cross-reference that with what was being said about what was being done. And so that's kind of bringing those two halves together. And I suppose, and I think particularly in my research, the census was a really useful source of information, which I was lucky enough that the period that I was doing this research coincided with the census data for that time period. So I suppose, in the sense of what is new, I think what it shows is why communities like New Earswick were new. And I think that's something that is probably forgotten about, because particularly, and I think you kind of alluded to this as well, Shaun, is the idea of ideas get co-opted by mainstream society so that you can't necessarily, it becomes much more difficult to pick them apart. And I think hopefully what I've done is to unpick some of those things that made it new.
Thank you very much. Everybody, please just show us some appreciation for Callum and Shaun. So recordings of the talks will be available on the Rowntree Society website and the Festival of Ideas website. I think that's after the 24th of June, by the way. And we'll share links to these in the coming weeks via the Society's newsletter. On the subject of the newsletter, just to flag that people who are, if you're not already signed up to the newsletter, you can do this. There is a sheet at the back of the hall for you to do that, or by going to the link at the bottom of our website, of the website homepage, which is rowntreesociety.org.uk. There's a few other thanks I'd just like to do at this point in time. I'd like to thank everybody, obviously, that's put the show together today. That's Linda Speedle, Stephen, Stan, and the Pilot Theatre's Livestream team, who have been behind all the technology you see here broadcasting out around the world. Everybody, and a final thank you as well to Callum and Shaun, and a moment of appreciation for everybody that's put this together, and for the entire Festival of Ideas team. Thank you very much.